Okay, here we are. Well, welcome to Seminar 16, Maximos Seminar 16. We're still with the Philokalia. We are reading the 4th century of various texts today. The 4th century of various texts. This accumulation of astonishing abysses and heights of thought. The theme that links what my little textual skating about is the integrity of a deed, the integrity of a deed. And this is understood to be in contemporary language over against moralism and intellectualism. This is one of the things that Maximus seems to stress and draw out deliberately and beautifully in this passage. The passages under question, just to briefly enumerate them. I am going to try to offer kind of a thought or two after each one, rather than explicate the work so much. So we'll be in the text, but then maybe we'll have some starting points for conversation after. The first is aphorism 10. Aphorism 10. Which is about the beauty, well, the phrase there is the beauty of the blessings held in store. The beauty of the blessings held in store. That's aphorism 10. And then aphorisms 26 through 28, so 26, 27, and 28. And this is about seeking or investigating, Maximus's terms again. Excuse me, he contrasts seeking and investigating. And then sections 53 and 54. And this is about God's gathering, God's gathering, and our participation in that gathering. So 53 and 54 about God's gathering and our participation in that gathering. And then 66, which is just remarkable. 66 brings about, well, Maximus mentions for the first time the hidden workshop of his heart. So that's my little title for this section, the hidden workshop of my heart. That's 66. And then 68 is about self-glory and deceit, self-glorying deceit. 68. And then 71 has to do with, well, in Maximus's phrase, the significance that underlies verbal form. The significance that underlies verbal form, right? That's 71. And then 75 is about polytheism and our senses. It's a lovely little passage, one of my very favorites. 75, polytheism and our senses. And then 88, which is, well, it's an abyss into which I have fallen. 88 is being tempted, lead us not into temptation, being tempted by illusions and by idols, a lack of integrity that tempts us to both illusions and idols. And then number 93 is about the patient endurance of the saints, the patient endurance of the saints. And then lastly, 97 is about, well, it's about peace, Irene, but it's about the norm of virtue, or the virtue of norm, the virtue of norm, a norm, the virtue of norm. Marquis. Okay, so 10 first of all, and this is brief because I just want to set this up. It's a reminder of something that he has said before, but it's good to note. Just the first 4 lines. All right, number 10. This is on page 237. So, he who is full of distress with respect to his flesh, because of the suffering he endures for the sake of virtue. He who is full of distress with respect to his flesh, because of the sufferings he endures for the sake of virtue, rejoices in his soul because of that very virtue. For he beholds as a present reality the beauty of the blessings held in store. And that's the phrase. He beholds as a present reality the beauty of the blessings held in store. So we have the connection between distress or what the person is present to in the moment, and virtue, which is the for sake of. So the structure is presence for the sake of virtue, right? We've come across this before. But the phrase, he beholds as a present reality the beauty of the blessings held in store. So the blessings held in store are real now. And it brings to mind something, Goa, you said, I believe last time, about, you've talked about presence and the presence and the fullness of the kingdom before. But in one of our recent sessions, you made explicit that that relationship is a dynamic. It's a dynamic. It is together. It's a movement of energy together. So presence and for the sake of, then, if they're teleological, they're not temporal. So the blessings held in store is not a temporal or historical observation. It's a question of telos, of fullness. Because Christ does not stand at a remove from us, right? We do not await God as if reality is only to come, as if this is to be sloughed off. And no, the blessed is present. What is blessed is present. So that's the first thing to note, I think. And then turn to 26 and through 28. It's page 241, and then just over the corner, over the side. Well, we can do, yeah, okay, here we go, 26 through 28. When the intellect in its longing is drawn in a manner beyond its understanding, right, drawn near, in a manner beyond its understanding to the source of created beings, it simply seeks. When the intelligence explores in various ways the true essences of created beings, it investigates, right? And he follows this distinction up. Seeking is the intellect, the nous's first simple, fervent movement towards its cause. Simple, fervent. Investigating is the intelligence, and remember that's the logical, the logos faculty in us. Logikos is how intelligence is. So it has to do with the logos. And investigating is the intelligence's first simple discernment of its own cause with the help of some concept. Seeking occurs when the intellect, spurred on by an intense longing, moves spiritually and in cognitive awareness towards its own cause, that's seeking. Investigating occurs when the intelligence, through the operation of the virtues, discerns its own cause with the help of some wise and profound concept. We can pause there. Actually. So just a couple of things that come to mind. Seeking, then, is our response to being drawn near by the divine. God calls us, draws us near. Seeking is how we respond to that. And it seems to be pure. Hold that word in mind, but it seems to me somehow pure, seeking. Investigating, which is much more involved and maybe an aesthetic enterprise, aesthetic as we've been understanding it in terms of the material world. Investigating is our considered struggle or effort to draw near. That's our drawing near to the divine with our own incarnate compass, right? With the help of created matter, created being. So seeking, again, just to repeat, involves the nous, the apophatic faculty, and investigating, which is the intelligence, involves our logos faculty, the logical, logikos faculty. Together, they suggest a joining of integrity and discernment, seeking, integrity, and investigating discernment, i.e. together they're a holy path. And drawn together, as they are in our liturgical worship, right? Drawn together as they are in our liturgical worship, where the seeking and also the human creative agency is part of it too, is an image of the kingdom, I would say. These two joint human pursuits or paths toward God. So an image of the kingdom, seeking and investigating. And we want to hold in mind that investigating involves drawing near with the help of some concept, right? Because how this goes awry is where we'll get to. All right, and then 53 to 54. So seeking and investigating or coalesce into an image of the kingdom. 53 and 54, which are page 249. This is about God's gathering and our response. 53 and 54. By a single infinitely powerful act of will, God in his goodness will gather all together, angels and men, the good and the evil. Right? That sounds like, so far, a certain doctrine which has taken hold of some people now. But although God pervades all things absolutely, not all will participate in him equally. They will participate in him according to what they are. All right. We can even just stop there, pause there again for the moment. So what do we have here? God in his goodness will gather all, and so on. Now, okay, so all are gathered, but what does gathering mean? What does gathering mean? Because we know that there is nothing but our blessed Lord and our blessed creation. It is gathered already. It is gathered. So looking back to seeking and investigating, I think that this gathering indicates how we respond to these things, how we respond. So God's gathering shows our response, and our response to his call gives shape to our soul. It can define our soul, not in categorical terms, but in a shape giving. And so I wonder, if we respond with gratitude, right, to God's gathering, with presence to God's gathering, with loving delight, as we read last time, if we respond with thankfulness, presence, loving delight, prayer and fasting, right, joy in company, seeking and investigating, those are all good modes of responding to that gathering, which is inevitable. Or we can also respond with our own conceits, as we began thinking about this term last time, our own conceited self-image, our own way forward, i.e., we forget about the seeking element and we begin to focus on our investigation and think that it is precious and something that we are doing. So responding to God's gatherings, God's gathering nature. The issue here is that our own conceits can seem divine or filled with goodness, and they might even be something of that. That's what we're gonna get to that. But our own conceits can seem divine, filled with goodness. So we can actually think we're drawing near to God, or participating in that gathering of God's, when in fact we are deeply estranged. Now, with that in mind, 66, aphorism 66, which is just over on 252. And I'm going to read the first just couple of lines from 65 and then go into 66. This is Maximos's imagery of the thief. So a thief is a man who, in order to deceive his hearers, pretends to reverence divine principles. Although he has not come to know the true quality of these principles through his actions, he traffics in glory. Isn't that damning? He traffics in glory merely by speaking about it, hoping that he will be thought righteous and thereby admired. And then over to 66. A man is also a thief when he conceals his soul's unseen evil behind a seemingly virtuous way of life and disguises his inner disposition with an affected innocence. Just as one kind of thief filches his audience's mind by uttering words of wisdom, it's an amazingly strong image, so this kind pilfers the senses of those who see him by his pretense of virtue. So just as one kind of thief filches the audience's mind by uttering words of wisdom, so this kind of thief pilfers the senses of those who see him by his pretense of virtue. To him it will be said, be ashamed of yourselves, all ye who are dressed in clothes which do not belong to you. And in that day, the Lord will reveal their pretense. And Maximus, I seem to hear God saying these things to me daily, in the hidden workshop of my heart. And I feel that I'm explicitly condemned on both accounts. So what does that mean? It's a slightly confessional turn, but he is saying this is not cheap. This runs through the heart of the spiritual life. 66. And if those last two lines don't sober us to the point of ascesis, then we should reconsider. 68. Oh no, sorry, about 66. Okay, I got carried away by the text. I was just so excited about the next.
I just want to accent that, Andrew.
Go on, David.
I was so struck when I read those last lines. You know, that he says, yes, this is me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the genius of someone like Maximus, who doesn't make most of it about him. So when this is a sincere move. Yeah. He's not posturing here.
Yeah.
This is his heart laid out, calmly laid out. Mm-hmm. So let's think about this idea of thieving, right? We have seen sin defined as misuse. That's the most common definition Maximus has offered so far. Sin is misuse. And I was thinking about that earlier today again. It is such an overturning of so much theology to consider sin as misuse that it feels like it should be a revolutionary idea. I mean, it's in the tradition. The tradition doesn't comprehend it necessarily, but it's in the tradition. Sin is misuse. Well, someone who deceives or draws others near him or her, them, through the appearance of virtue, well, falsely drawing near, then, is misappropriation. Misappropriation, right? This is a spiritual thief, the act of a spiritual thief, pulling from another, glory, deference, accord, pulling from another to ourselves what rightfully, what fittingly, what appropriately, this is why it's misappropriation, is offered unto God. We're seeking the acclaim that is due to God in ourselves, right? And so here, one is falsely present, not really present, falsely present, and for the sake of oneself, right? Or put a little bit differently, one is lying about oneself. One is caught up in an illusion which I'm convinced, can only be painful if it's admitted within those of us who suffer from this. It can only be painful. But by all appearances, it's still words of wisdom and still virtuous action. So what distinguishes? What signals the difference between truth and a lie here? This is a question I can't answer. We can come back to it. But I think it has to do with something to do with its telos, how it sees fullness, and its eschatological form, or telos, how it sees completion, and eschatology, how it sees fullness, and about being able to hear the call of God, the kalon, to kalon of the divine, something to do with that. 68 illuminates this a little bit more for us, I think. So let's turn to 68 here. It's just over the page. Just over the page. He who simulates spiritual knowledge merely by the utterance of words filches the mind of those who hear him in order to boost his own reputation. This is reminiscent of the previous passage. Similarly, he who simulates virtue in his outward behavior pilfers the sight of those who look to him, once more in order to promote his own self-glory. Both steal by means of deceit, the first perverting the audience's mind, the second the bodily sense of those who see him. Now, a spiritual thief here. Maximus is talking about ill-gotten gains. Ill-gotten gains. Even if they are beautiful, precious things, and virtue and wisdom are beautiful, precious things. Even if they're beautiful and precious, their worth will not be ultimately acknowledged due to their inappropriate provenance. All right? A thief has ill-gotten gains. The worth cannot be ultimately acknowledged, for they do not belong. These things are they've been appropriated. They do not belong, which means they can't be a part of the person's spiritual integrity, right? It's like a shift, or like a mask. And spiritual integrity combined with seeking is how one is drawn to God, right? So not only are these gifts, which can be profound, often they are very profound and beautiful, but held in this way, they become worthless. Held in this way, they become worthless. And even worse than that, they tempt others to the same estrangement of the thief, right? This is an extraordinarily strong or compelling account of how, as the Archbishop Lazar liked to say, we can lose our soul through our virtues as quickly as through our vices. All right. And now 71, it's just down that page. So this might seem like a little bit of a sidestep, but what we're talking about is a false composite nature of a person rather than integrity, an integrity of the person, right? So that composite, which Maximus rejects for the divine, is the opposite of integrity. So this is about that composite, or seeing something as composite. And Michael, I wonder particularly what you think about this. So 71, not all persons and things designated in Holy Scripture by the same word are necessarily to be understood in exactly the same way. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. On the contrary, if we are to infer the meaning of the written text correctly, each thing mentioned must be clearly understood according to the significance that underlies its verbal form. So each thing must be clearly understood according to the significance that underlies its verbal form. And this significance which underlies the verbal form, that's what intrigues me. So these are some thoughts, and then we'll get back to. I think that all claims regarding the conventional or the arbitrary nature of language, right? The conventional or the arbitrary nature of language rely on a conception of language that states that language is essentially naming. Language is essentially naming. Now, despite its biblical roots in the creation story, I think that this metaphor for language as essentially naming is deeply problematic when comprehended lightly. To name something is to apply a concept to a thing, right? Which makes possible falsity. It makes possible calling yourself a saint while not actually being a saint, or calling wisdom to yourself while not actually being full of wisdom. That's a thesis which goes and goes and goes. But here, another idea. Maximus says the significance that underlies its verbal form. Now, and here's my thesis. If one considers the gestural essence of language, the moving, the kinesis, the dynamic at the essence of language, right? And considers articulation and saying apophatically, right? So if one considers the gestural essence of language and considers articulation and saying, the act of saying, to say, apophatically, one need not be suspicious of or jettison language in terms of reality, right? We need not see a distinction there. We do because of this idea of naming that we have. In other words, language, which is based on the logos, the word emerges with authority from and within reality, right? From and within reality. So Maximus is indicating here, in my opinion, that this falsity means we're not even actually saying anything. We're not using language. We're masquerading behind an illusion that we think. Okay. Now 75. When the senses have the intellect in their clutches, oh, just over the page, 254, pardon me, 254, 75. When the senses have the intellect in their clutches, they propagate polytheism through each individual sense organ. Isn't that great? I think of it like the sun is too beautiful, so we begin to think that sight is divine. And then music is too glorious, so we begin to think, oh, our ears are divine. And then we taste fruit and we think, surely taste is divine. When the senses have the intellect in their clutches, they propagate polytheism through each individual sense organ. Okay, because in their slavery to the passions, they pay divine honors to the sensible objects corresponding to each organ. All right. Now, for me, that is about the beauty of creation, first of all, right? And it is also the idea that our senses, our movements, our gestures, our transformations, all of the aesthetic words we apply to the spiritual life, they're all good. They're all good. And they're at the center of the divine, right? Creation is at the center of our apprehension of the divine. It's what we use to investigate, and it gives us our natural seeking. But when our delight in the senses turns into covetousness, right? Or our desire turns into lust, then our gods, the for the sake of, the thing that we do things for the sake of, our gods multiply outrageously, right? Our gods multiply when our delight turns into covetousness or desire into lust. But they multiply beautifully. This is polytheism. Creation still is beautiful. We are just not responding to it in a way which will allow us in, right? And the beauty of our senses begins to sound like a little bit like the beauty of our lies about ourselves, the beauty about our conceits, all right? The beauty about our own forms, our own self, because our own self is beautiful if we understand the scriptures. All of ourselves are beautiful, but how we respond to that. All right, now to 88, which is the other unbelievable passage. And I want to preface this by reminding us that our lies are usually beautiful. Our lies are usually very beautiful. So how to discern them, All right, 88, this is on 257. And this one overturned me when I first read it, and I'm still overturned. He who embodies spiritual knowledge in his practice of the virtues and animates this practice with spiritual knowledge has found the perfect method of accomplishing the divine work. He in whom spiritual knowledge and ascetic practice are not united either makes the first, spiritual knowledge, an unsubstantial illusion, or turns the second into a lifeless idol. So spiritual knowledge alone is an unsubstantial illusion. That's what it is, no matter how beautiful it looks. And ascetic practice alone is a lifeless idol. It is a lifeless idol. So moralism is a lifeless idol, and intellectualism is unsubstantial illusion, right? All right. For spiritual knowledge not put into practice, this is what terrifies me. Spiritual knowledge not put into practice does not differ in any way from illusion. It doesn't differ in any way from illusion, lacking such practice to give it real substance. And practice, uninformed, not inwardly formed by intelligence, by our logikos, our logic, our logos faculty, is like an idol, since it has no knowledge to animate it. All right. This is very hard because what he's pointing to here, I suffer from. And so it's blind wandering nearly. But thinking about how our lies are usually beautiful and how we can discern them, I thought, how can we tell a lie? Maybe, this is my wondering, perhaps lies are too insistent. Lies are too insistent. Perhaps we enter into the realm of lying when we are too insistent, too self-sure, right? Too ready for opposition, right? Too ready to defend ourselves, too certain in and of itself. That might be a way for us to begin to discern, right? Perhaps lies are too insistent, too certain in and of itself. And that idea of being certain in and of itself makes me wonder, maybe, in a manner of speaking, everything is a lie, except in relation. Except in relation. Everything in the spiritual life is a lie, except in relation, which means integrity dispels the lie. Not another word, not an argument. Integrity dispels the lie. In other words, it's a way of saying no one thing is good. Only in relation, only with integrity, only in communion do things become blessed, right? That's a question that I think is open, and that's as far as I can go safely with this passage, because if I take him seriously, then I have to think, well, most of my thoughts are lies somehow. So what is going on there if I am not proceeding with integrity? If I'm separating, just making this mental effort, or separating and just making this physical effort, helping somebody, not caring, not praying. And I do both. I change off and on, right? That's too hard of a thought for now. Okay, 93 now. Just moving over to 93. It's 258 near the bottom. 258 near the bottom. The patient endurance of the saints exhausts the evil power that attacks them, since it makes them glory in sufferings undergone for the sake of truth. It teaches those too much concerned with a life in the flesh to deepen themselves through such sufferings instead of pursuing ease and comfort. It makes the flesh's natural weakness in the endurance of suffering a foundation for overwhelming spiritual power. For the natural weakness of the saints is precisely such a foundation of overwhelming spiritual power, since the Lord has made their weakness stronger than the proud devil. Well, just a few thoughts here. This is a holy response. He's framing it in terms of the saints, responding to what we have just been outlining. The holy response is patience. But patience what? Patience in the midst of glorying in sufferings, rather than glorying in one's own conceit, right? In one's own image. So it's a paradoxical almost idea. And it brings us back to the very first, distress and virtue. Distress undergone for the sake of virtue is blessed. Well, here he's changing the term slightly. Patience in the midst of glorying in sufferings, rather than glorying in one's own conceit, is blessed. And then he has this phrase, David, I thought of you, the natural weakness of the saints. And that brought to mind, David, your phrase, the ways of imperfection. You have spoken in the past about the desert fathers and mothers, and sometimes it's understood as, the ways to perfect one's soul. But there's a deep spiritual sense that the ways of imperfection is perhaps a surer guide somehow. And the only other thing I want to note here is that the patient endurance, glory in the sufferings, and then this phrase, it teaches those too much concerned with a life in the flesh, a life in the flesh. Well, a life in the flesh looks exactly like a lying mind from the previous section here. A life in the flesh is not worse than a mind given to illusion in the kind of in the general sense, particular sense, maybe. The natural weakness of the saints, glorying in sufferings. And then 97. This is just the bottom of 259. And this too is just a remarkable passage. Like I said, I think it's about 97. It's about Irene, peace, the state of the saints ultimately. Just to read. Spiritual knowledge of virtue, true and actualized knowledge of the cause of virtue, naturally produces total ignorance of the excess and deficiency which lie to the right and the left of the norm of virtue. Nothing in the intelligence can be contrary to the intelligence. Thus, he who has come to apprehend the principle of virtue will clearly have no way of knowing that state that is contrary to the intelligence. One cannot examine two opposites simultaneously and know the one at the same time as the other. Right. Well, earlier we said that seeking, the act of seeking, might be a kind of pure act. So the norm of virtue, the middle way, the royal road of virtue, or the virtue of norm, the virtue of a middle way. The knowledge he's talking about here is knowledge, yes, knowledge, but it becomes knowledge of cause, of the cause, the knowledge of the cause of being. And this knowledge is the biblical knowing, the intimate relating with. It's not an abstract or theoretical knowledge, knowledge of the cause. But knowledge of the cause means an entry into the genesis, the ethos of the thing, right? To know in this sense is not to know abstractly. It's to become ravished by, in language from last time, or gathered into, right? In other words, knowledge of the cause means adopting rather its compass, its own direction, its own way of being. And this seems to me to be the essence of purity. I'm not too sure about this. I like to begin here, but this seems to me the essence of purity, right? And purity then would be, purity is of an integrity that cannot but be present, that cannot but be present, all right? I think that's one way of thinking about purity. In this sense, if you cannot but be present, purity per se knows no opposite, right? Just like presence doesn't know how to be absent. It doesn't know how to. It's not, it is nonsense. Presence and seeking don't know how to be anything but pure, maybe. It's only our investigating, to go back to Maximos' term, our investigating, our seeking to draw near by the use of some concept or natural imagery. It's only our investigating that lets us understand the knowledge, understand and know the difference between presence and absence, right? And so that's one of my questions. What does it mean not to know? Not to know. And the imagery which seems to apply here would be the tree of life. The tree of life is pure. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which enters us into the conflagration and the struggle and the chaos and the beauty and the what have you of life. That is what gives us the difference between presence and absence. Seeking does not. Seeking is essential. investigating, which is what we are doing, and most of us do a good portion of our lives. That's the danger. That's the danger, right? And put it in, I was talking with Peter Drobats this morning, which some of you know, and I told him this, and he said, yeah, well, seeking is of Christ, first and only. Seeking is of Christ. That is most important, and that is not related to being able to articulate, not related to being able to lay forth arguments or any. That's also there, and that follows seeking Christ. But seeking Christ does not depend on that. And I think in a way, he was getting to what I'm trying to get at here. The tree of life stands alone, right? That's what we seek. Our investigating, and this century is about how our investigating can go wrong, in my opinion. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's what we didn't want at the beginning. That's what wasn't, dispensed for us. This is our own misuse, our own waywardness. But let me pause there. What do we make of this idea of not knowing the opposite, not knowing? What does that mean? David, why don't you begin? Or Michael, why don't you begin? Or Lorraine, why don't you begin? David, what do you make of this whole century? And you said it earlier, it's just
the other two know so much about knowing. So
I'll defer to Lorraine.
What do you make of this last passage, Lorraine? 97. Or another passage. I don't want to put you on the spot if this didn't stand out for you. You know, it's just a way of opening up or walking back into other things. What stood out for you on the whole in this passage or in the work?
Well, I think what stood out to me was, again, going back to what we talked about, this idea of how easily we lie to ourselves, and then how do we ensure that what we're saying, how do we not become vain in our own spiritual practices, is really what stood out to me. And then if this is I don't want to say the root of all evil, but if this is the beginning, right, these illusions, I am still stuck on how do we make sure that what we're thinking isn't like, or how do we make sure that we aren't falling into this? Because I think you could also become almost obsessive, right? Like there's a kind of fear that you could become almost scrupulous in, trying to worry about, is this a true thought? Am I lying to myself? Is this, is this actually true and meaningful? And so I became quite stuck in this century on that idea. And how do we actually know that without almost becoming like Cartesian in our fear of, I'm thinking because I'm thinking, and therefore, how do I know whether or not I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And I think also with the practices, I mean, spiritual practices, I think we can all acknowledge, at least in my own life, there's times where they're done for what I presume to be good and morally correct or virtuous, I guess not even morally correct, but virtuous ideas or ideals, I should say. But there's also absolutely opportunities where does that feed my own vainglory and so on. So sorry, I'm kind of rambling here. So cut me off, but
Oh, go on. Go on.
I really am, in some ways, I was really struck by that. I think especially too, because of the fact that he's writing to his own monks, right? So he's not just speaking to, you kind of heathen lay people out there who aren't doing these practices, but he's actually speaking more directly to people who are doing this, right? Who are constantly engaging in these practices, and for whom I think we would imagine that they would be in some ways beyond these early temptations. Sorry, I lost where I was going with there. So I think, just how much it struck me that that's what he's trying to say to his own people. So in general, overall, I think that's the pieces that struck me the most reading this century, which also leaves you slightly rattled, I think, spiritually, in terms of what does that actually translate to. So I'll leave it there. That was sort of rambly and all over the place.
So Noreen, what would you say to this notion that, and I really appreciate the way you raised this notion that you can't know. All your effort at knowing just enlarges confusion. And so you engage, you do, you act, and then you know. And then you know. And that's why forgiveness is the center of the Christian faith, not what most people think purity is, or moral, some kind of moral precept. I mean, Jesus said that all have sinned and come short of the glory. I'm not sure we can know. I mean, and this sounds like a justification to myself, Maybe it is. But that kind of lying to ourselves that Andrew has laid out here with such lovely clarity, because it is lying to ourselves, it is a real illusion. It is a real illusion. And I think that's why I was so touched by Maximus's little confessional note. But this is who I am too. That the human mind and the human heart are such that this is the landscape we walk. So I've thought for a long time, rightly or wrongly, that the gift of the spiritual life is to lessen the time between when we sin, our act, our misstep, and we become conscious of it and turn around, seek, repair, whatever is required in that. But what do you think of that? Is that ridiculous on my part?
No, I'm struck by your comment about forgiveness, because it does move out of a type of moralism, right? I mean, I would agree with you, there's almost this conception or preconception that, the most holy life is the one that sort of somehow intuitively just knows and knows not how to sin, right? That somehow the saints are able to, shall we say, bypass, this experience and come to some sort of almost elevated divine knowledge, which isn't true. I mean, but I think this is almost just how it's kind of conceptually perceived, broadly, colloquially perceived, then it does lead to a type of moralism where the idea being that, you try your very hardest to preconceive what it is that you're going to do, and hopefully if you kind of calculate it correctly, then you're going to be able to avoid sinning. And I think that perhaps is the root of it, because then you get into because there's such a hubris with that, right? Because you can believe your own, well, because we have a fallen human intellect too, right? Which is something I don't think we spend enough time speaking about. So I really appreciate your comment, David, in terms of forgiveness being the heart of the Christian message, because it really is it's really sort of removing that concept of calculability of sin somehow, or some sort of pre-knowledge that we're not going to be affected by it.
So can I read 93 just in light of this little talk here? In light of the saints you were referring to, Lorraine, which I've never met. All the saints I've met are, well, what can I say? The patient endurance of the saints exhausts the evil power that attacks them. So it makes them glory in sufferings undergone for the sake of truth. When you act, or when you move, and you discover that you misunderstood, you missed the mark, what you thought was good was not. You discover that, as Andrew pointed out, the telos of it was your own appetite and not for the sake of God. When you realize that the telos of it was about your presumption about what was good for the other, and not for the sake of God, whatever that means. The patient endurance of the saints through that process, not to avoid it, but through it, the suffering of it, for the sake of truth, in order to come to that knowing which is not knowing, really. It teaches those too much concerned with a life in the flesh to deepen themselves through such sufferings instead of pursuing ease and comfort. One of the problems with monastics sometimes has been they become almost solipsistic. You know, they are not willing to engage for fear they misstep. So here the suggestion is that entering into that, it makes the flesh's natural weakness in the endurance of suffering a foundation for overwhelming spiritual power. For the natural weakness of the saints is precisely such a foundation, since the Lord has made their weakness stronger than the proud devil. So I wonder if saints aren't the ones that sin with ease, and bolder still, pay attention to what it means and learn from it. I don't know. It's curious to me anyways.
That's beautifully put, David, especially you're drawing attention to the where is it? Well, that he's not saying that they're exempt from this, that this is undergone, but it's undergone with that stance of mind, or that response, which is anchored still in truth in our Lord, but not pretending that what they are, what they're undergoing, or what is present or real is not there. That would be lying about it.
Or put another way, I don't know if we can know that something is virtuous and something isn't.
Not until relation. Yeah.
Not until the relationship is there. Not until it is discerned through the relationship.
Yeah.
Everything else is an abstraction.
How does that then link back to just the biblical, Andrew, you mentioned the idea of like the tree of good and evil, like the tree of knowledge.
I'm sorry, what was the first part of that, Lorraine?
Oh, just that idea, if we ultimately can't know, and we don't know until we enter into a relationship. I was just wondering, this idea of not knowing, obviously, and Andrew had mentioned the idea of the tree of good and evil, like that it was to know. I mean, is that in and of itself a lie that we could know?
Of course, it's the big lie.
It's the big lie.
It presumes. But what even predates that, certainly in sort of orthodox treatment of that story, is you can't know the big lie. Maybe I should put it this way. Knowing the lie is simultaneously forgetting that you already are in communion. So, I mean, the temptation for the human nature to hear the temptation of the liar, of the rumor monger, the human nature has to have forgotten or become or stepped aside of the fact that they already were like God. And you have to buy the second lie, which is that God knows good and evil, which God doesn't know. Because that's a division, and God is singular. And in God, there is only life. So it seems to me at the heart of that narrative is this. It's a narrative really about self-estrangement. But it's a danger to think that somehow or other, the communion in the cool of the evening, in the garden, up to the point of the temptation, we can turn that into a kind of idealization instead of understanding that this is a narrative about how our mind and our heart work in the world. And it's a revelation about how communion is broken. The communion is normal. That's what life is. Life is the garden of communion. But it gets broken. And then the process of return the human being has longing for that communion. That didn't change. The longing remains. And as that narrative says later on, and they walked out of the garden, but Adonai walked out with them. I mean, that's one of the amazing pieces in that narrative. And God went with them. So, so I don't know. I mean, I don't think there is any way of knowing outside of the relationship and discovering that what you thought you knew lacked integrity. It reveals the hidden purposes of your heart, which is then a suffering, which needs healing. What do you think, Michael? Does this sound crazy?
No, I think it's nice the way you even problematize the relationships, because of course not all relationships are wholesome. But I'm glad that you also emphasize it's important, to also emphasize, as you just did in that little codicil to the story, and God went with them. It seems that Maximus is continually not allowing the tension to go slack between these two aspects of knowing. He, on the one hand, talks of what amount to kind of conditions in those singular moments when we can, I won't say achieve spiritual knowledge, but when spiritual knowledge seems to be available. I'm using this word seems to be just to, pay homage to the tentativeness and suspicion of certainty, and, or to use Andrew's word, insistence in this conversation up to now. But it's important, that just as that when Maximus says that God bestows grace on us for our sake, and that his energies in, for example, aphorism 19 are direct and infinite.
Mm-hmm.
That's important also, and that transcendence is available, and that our intellectual faculties were bestowed on us. As Milton said, God made reason right. But it's not something that, it's not a faculty of unrelated self-resurrection. It's a faculty that makes us susceptible or ready for God's grace. It's quite striking that he actually says that without this faculty of intelligence, we wouldn't be able to receive God's grace. But we're, of course, not responsible for the faculty itself, since, as I just said, it's something implanted by God.
Mhm.
But there is a picture of synergy here. So I think
Mhm.
the main thing is that it's quite striking, quite modern the way, the number of times when he targets both a kind of reductivism and also a kind of behaviorism. When I was listening to Andrew talking about language, I think that it's struck me, it's never really occurred to me this explicitly before, that the kind of behaviorism that he talks about in section 66 and aphorism 66 and 68 is brackets that moment of self-confession. And it seems to me that a certain kind of truthful confessional moment of the kind that Maximus reveals when he's talking about when he makes the confession, he talks about how he feels that he's explicitly condemned in the hidden workshop of my heart.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
Because it interrogates in a way that isn't normally done behaviorism. Interestingly enough, this is a little ironic, given this kind of interrogation of can we know. The traditional, or one of the traditional arguments against the idea of behaviorism is that if behaviorism were true, B.F. Skinner's form of behaviorism, we would be incapable of knowing.
Mhm.
And free will would also be a null concept.
Yeah.
But it's easy to fall into a kind of confidence that, okay, let's reject behavior is not an easy thing to do. It's an ongoing temptation. But the contrast that allows us to reject it is our faculty of knowing and being in volition. But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that that's a kind of self-resurrecting, I'm repeating what I said earlier, faculty. So within those qualifications, I think we can take a more guardedly optimistic view, because to fall into that, what you refer to as solipsism and perhaps even the cynicism,
Mhm.
is to reject God's love,
Mhm.
his energies which are
Mhm.
direct and infinite.
Mhm.
And I think there's a spiritual danger in
Mhm.
that.
Behaviorism, and what was the other thing that you said that Maximus responds to, as if he was?
Well, I think it was quite, I mean, probably in other places, but in this whole century, a few things, a kind of reductivism at times.
Oh yeah, reductive.
I mean, he also simultaneously, because at times, one might, if one's reading casually and not reading fully and over many texts, think that Maximus is susceptible of a kind of dualism, but he's highly conscious of the problem of dualism. And in this century, in those places when he refers to the relationship between the flesh and spirit, saying that the flesh depends on the spirit, but the spirit doesn't depend on the flesh. I think he's getting the priority right, but he's also he's not susceptible to a dualism there, because he sees these as related, but they're not related in a way that reduces the spirit to flesh. I mean, that's sort of the big modern temptation. there is no consciousness, there is no mind. It's all basically, it comes out in, you know, pretty absurd forms in people like, the Churchlands, but Patricia Churchland in particular, you know, it can come out in sort of ludicrous and easily, you know, rejected forms. But I think it's a temptation. And relativism and a kind of facile indeterminacy, you know, toward the very end. He also seems to be gunning, well, maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. He apprehends the danger of those, you know, certainly, you know, the very last section and earlier too.
Michael, may I ask, I'm not sure if this is possible, but do you think it's possible to characterize his approach? Can we say a little bit about the way he approaches them? I mean, how do you see that? You said that he navigates and avoids these various, you know, pitfalls, stumbling blocks. And I really like your account because
well,
your
I
way
think,
of articulating.
yeah, David seems to be emulating this because insofar as he's constantly balancing, and he came out wonderfully in this phrase, kind of knowing that is not knowing. It's a wonderful paradox. And I think the purpose of a kind of a useful paradox is that it arrests the temptation to allow to kind of teeter-totter concepts, you know, one way or the other, and rather to integrate them in a way. So knowing isn't a simple thing. There are a lot of, just putting a little dryly, conditions. But to get to your point, rather than talking about, you know, dryly analytically about the conditions for this or that, he simply exposes you to what might seem like extremes if interpreted in a kind of sterile, through mono interpretation, because you can always, you know, await a qualification or something that seems to be going against what he had earlier said. So I guess that would be one characterization. I suppose one form of false communion would be the kind of communion that we're all involved in when we speak a language. This is just getting back to your, I was quite, I was fully in agreement with your thesis. And one way of characterizing it is that this, we're constantly, and this is another example of, you know, I think, you know, we, as David says, we are in communion in a healthy way, but we're also simultaneously susceptible to a false communion. And misconceiving language, I think there's a misconception of language that it's a series of, I'm reiterating something I've said many weeks ago, but kind of set of conventions that provide a certain assurance or semantic insistent quality that thinks that we speak a language, we have this intellectual faculty, therefore we can know things. But that seeking, which is more apophatic in nature, should be a clue to the way language really works. It really works through a kind of agency, which and endless interpretive, rational, creative capacity that is also a continuous source outside of us of a grace that is just bewildering, because the words of language are orienting us through convention, but ultimately even the most basic words that we're using certainly in a conversation like this, we're talking about, things like agency and person and these concepts that are inexplicable. And to the extent that we use them and can thrive with them, that itself is an act of grace. And I'm not meaning to apply a quick ontological argument, but something like that. A kind of ontological argument for the logos is something I think is actually the case. I don't think that just as individuals using a language, we would be able to understand anything. It's an insufficient condition. And the temptation to say that we've, through history, as a collective, interpreted words in a certain way, and we can exchange information like this is just an illusion.
I love the distinction between communication and language. And the notion that animals communicate, but they don't have language. And that suggests to me that language is well, the word is not something. The logos is not something. It's an unfolding.
I mean, I would like to think of language in the way that Andrew was thinking of it, as opposed to more provocatively, as Donald Davidson did a little naughtily, perhaps, in an essay that he starts out saying that there is no such thing as a language at all. But then he qualifies it. If we understand by a language what most or many linguists and philosophers of language think of a language. But of course, we shouldn't think of a language that way, as a bunch of conventions, syntactic and semantic conventions, because these semantic conventions, these concepts, are things we sort of understand, but they're inexplicable. But for this wouldn't go over well probably in a secular-minded linguistic or philosophy of language group, but something outside of us. I mean, they're concepts like agency or personhood. These are utterly inexplicable, or truth or meaning, or concept of a belief. These are all utterly inexplicable, and yet we use these concepts all the time because there is some grace-giving logos that infuses them with a meaning that is beyond us, beyond our capacity to explicate.
Micah, I like very much, I mean, it was just a beautiful account on the whole. I want to push a couple of points and see how you respond. First, just isn't that ultimate inexhaustibility or ultimate inexplicability of language, isn't that then asking the wrong question? Isn't thinking that might be possible wrong-headed in a sense? It's seeing language as something that could potentially be exhausted. That's my first question, because if that means that the semantic horizon of language is limitless, I think that's beautiful, right? And that's true. But it reminds me of something else you said earlier about language seemingly imposing a kind of false communion, or the metaphor for false communion language. But then you also said, and yet language is something that gives us beyond ourselves. It's in a way, it's a kind of repository of insight or greatness or genius or grace too. And that brings to mind Gadamer's idea that language is essentially a form of tradition, that it behaves kind of like a tradition in its continuities and in what it offers, and how it's both personally rendered, but always, to use this language again, inexhaustible in its part. It can never be kind of fully misappropriated, fully as in Maximus. I like that you came to these 66 and 68 too, because they're so striking. But as Maximus says, you know, to thieve via language. And so those are two questions or responses, or I mean, you can respond or not respond as you see fit. But then it seems to open for me a deeper thing, which is that language is, like tradition, inexhaustible, and it's one of our human continuities. A lie that is not incoherent, but rather that is not an integral part of that human being, as we said, can be beautiful, right? Often, I mean, we're speaking in this heightened sense, not in the base sense of, you know, manipulation or some overt manipulation for, you know, we're talking about deception or illusion. So far we've focused our thoughts on the lack of integrity that can kind of illuminate in a person. But wisdom, even if it's your lie, remains wisdom. That's one of the things that Maximus is saying. The garment is still beautiful. It just, I shouldn't be wearing it. So then, and this is a question I can't answer, so I really want to open it up to you, David, Lorraine. Knowing that, we refrain in our minds from, as you put it, Lorraine, in terms of the self, being too scrupulous with ourselves. Yeah, well, being too scrupulous with others too. Because, well, or to put another way, even if we could recognize it, what would change if we thought someone else was lying in this in this way of speaking? Even if we thought we could recognize it, and I don't think that we readily can. It wouldn't change how we respond to them. We would respond to the best in what they're offering, which would be have to do something with their lie. For us, it's not quite a lie. Does that make sense? That's a groping thought. The thief who is in it for his own glory, but imparts some wisdom to his audience, despite himself almost. What do we do with that? How do we understand that scene, that event? Pardon me, please.
I think to take the hardest case, and I know this is something we both we have a kind of, for lack of a better word, conservative sensibility. I won't speak for everyone here, but I think I share that with you, Andrew. I have a kind of traditionalist bent, as it were. But I'm always wary of traditions, the historical circumstances of traditions, an issue that Maximus raises in the very last section. It could be, I think, in a facile way, interpreted as a kind of worry about a form of relativism. But there's a relativism, which is the thesis that all truth is relative, which just dissolves the very concept of truth, distinct from a more sensible position, which is to say that we're not always personally or culturally in the right historical set of circumstances, personal circumstances or societal historical circumstances, where we can properly apprehend certain truths, which is why there's, an expansion, hope this isn't too neat, beyond, you know, the declarations in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is, and in some societies, you know, parliamentary democracy might be appropriate, in others it might be an imposition that lacks integrity. And so integrity is always something that is requires more than just whatever a tradition at one particular point in its development offers up to it. There must always be something beyond that's feeding that tradition, because there, of course, I was joking about, not, this puts it in the wrong way, I was referring ironically to the charge of Nazism being directed against Ukrainians. But Nazism is a form of a nostalgic kitsch form of, you know, fascism in general, trying to recover a tradition without integrity. And even traditions that have a kind of continuity and have been around for a long time can degenerate and lose their connection, the relationship with the kind of grace that is, albeit infinite and direct, can also be just turned away from. And not all traditions, if all traditions were perfect, of course, we would be in a wonderful global reality, wouldn't we? And history would just be merrily carrying on to some sort of endpoint, you know, that is inevitable and necessary, and etc. But that's the kind of worst kind of, you know, Hegelian attitude. Hegel had I think a more productive thought, that more existentially charged thought, that no matter that we should embrace those commitments of our tradition or something we're trying to understand in communing with others, recognizing that what we're embracing probably also will perish, and that we should recognize that many of our bright ideas, things that we turn into a kind of iconic attachment, should die, and that's the only way that we can regain integrity and have a kind of living integrity. We have to continually die to the things that we love.
Beautiful.
And there's no escaping that.
You know, Hegel actually makes an astute point. Not only is there no escaping it, but if just trying to push it under and kind of half live with beliefs that might have been appropriate under certain circumstances, but which are fraying at the edges, and just trying to patch it up and live with it. It's important to embrace them thoroughly and through their death, that we might resurrect a new view. But this could only make sense. Nietzsche has the same idea that we have to, in a moment of crisis and transition, reevaluate our values. But this could only make sense if there is a good, which will always, in our mortality, our finite perspective, approximate. But for whatever grace is also feeding into our attempt to reintegrate things or strive towards some integrity of a new belief or commitment or value.
It's grace you're talking about right now, and the way that you talked about,
absolutely, explicitly.
And the way that you talked about the tradition needing a flow, a confluence also from the divine or from the good.
Absolutely.
So is this, I mean, I'm with you. That's a beautiful way of putting it, I think. You mentioned the word synergy before. Do you see this as a synergistic relationship, or do you think that term doesn't quite apply to what you're talking about? That was one question.
I think it does. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I have three questions. The second, then is tradition kind of in its ethos related to how Maximus talks about investigating? So the seeking, which is our response to being drawn, and tradition is kind of our investigating, and how beautifully that can be done and how terribly that can veer. That's my side. And then the third question is, following this model, is the logos that same source for language itself? Do you see that connection too? Because you related to, and you think positive language, and it was earlier it was related to tradition, this idea. Do you think that one could say the logos, the living word, bears that relationship to language too? Pardon me if either any of those don't make
I'll
sense.
just maybe I could just I'll just answer or attempt to answer the last question using that particular phrase, because logos can be used different way in different contexts. But but if you use it as the living word and it has this a transcendent source, then I would say yes. I can't imagine speaking a language if that weren't the case.
At the heart of the liturgy, we have the epiclesis. We have this moment where we turn and say, "Come, Holy Spirit." And it seems to me that in every human encounter, whether it is, mostly it's not said, but that is a disposition. That is a kind of disposition. And it's the disposition which there is a certain obvious humility in it, lack of presumption in it, lack of knowing in it. It's a regard for a transfiguration, for that which is being made new in that moment. And when he talks about the thieves, or in this act of theft, one can't help but think of the great narrative we have of this. There were two trees in the garden, or at least there appeared to be, even though W.H. Auden says there's only one tree. The other was a fiction of the evil one. And there are two thieves. And the one presumes. Even in the midst of dying, he is not aware of what's happening. He's blaming. He's demanding. And the other one simply says, "Remember me. May I again become a part of communion." It's an epiclesis. It's a welcoming of the Spirit that makes all things new. It's a resurrection moment. It is a breaking in of the kingdom that is coming.
Just to link that remember me is what we say just prior to communion in the church too. We state the words of the thief. Pardon me, David.
Yeah.
Do you say that after the come to me?
It's kind of the common prayer, the last common prayer where we identify. I will not speak of thy mysteries to thine enemies, neither like Judas will I give thee a kiss, but like the thief will I confess thee. Remember me today in your kingdom. So I will not speak of your mysteries to your enemies is overreaching, with the intellectual, assuming that clear conceptual articulation is real. Well, it's important. It's not insignificant, but it isn't the point. Neither like Judas will I give thee a kiss. I mean, what's so striking to me about it, and what all of you are saying, and the way Lorraine opened this up, it seems to me that he is also getting at that disposition of being present to what is unfolding. But even in the midst of that, as I think he's pointing out here as well, we can even be in that, we can think those sorts of thoughts. And in fact, discover that there was some kind of self-orientation in it. It was not an openness to what was being given, to what was unfolding. And again, I don't know if there's, my sense is there's no way around that other than in the encounter and through the encounter and what is unveiled in that. I would like to think that over time and with both thought and ascetic discipline, one becomes perhaps a bit clearer and more able but I don't know, and when I read his words, which I seem to hear God saying these things to me daily in the hidden workshop of my heart. we don't stand on, privileged ground, but in our relationship to each other, there can be these sufferings that surface that speak about our integrity and our lack of it. And we can pray for their healing. And hope for their sanctification. And that to me is, this lovely reflection you were given about language. I'm always so struck by conversations. I had one here the other night with a few people, and it went over some ground that we had walked a month ago, which had led to really, really hostile and deep disintegration. So we walked that. We didn't repeat it, but we walked up to those things again, but in a way that where the words which were initially used and the conceptual frameworks that were initially used a few months ago broke open, where I guess I would say a more humble and larger sense of meaning became apparent. There's such a difference between going away from a conversation where you say, where there's some insight that you received, versus going away from a conversation where there may be agreement or disagreement or a conceptual muddle or an angry argument, but where there's no light. So the word, the logos, is light. It's just a footnote to that, going back a ways to this comment about about naming. It's always been striking to me that in the Hebrew Bible, naming is another way of talking about blessing. When you name something, you are blessing it. It is a form of regard. So the naming is particular. It's a particular wonder and a particular delight. And it's blessing because it's not finished. It's whatever is named is alive, is becoming. So the word is made flesh and dwells among us. And we have seen his glory. But that's not something. It's light, it's beauty.
What do you think about Andrew's thought that there's also a risk in naming and devotion to the things we name? I don't know if that characterized what you were saying. Maybe you want to put this differently.
I think that there's a deeper thing to explore here. So I would rather not just put it in those terms for now. But but I am interested in what David thinks about that approach. David, do you mind if I'm sorry, Michael. Pardon, I'm sorry. Were you going to?
No,
David,
no.
May I just walk back into a couple of things you said, because I think that how you put that is very striking, and I'm wondering about relating that to something else that you've taught. You've said before. Earlier tonight, you said truth is discerned through relationship, right? And then just 5-10 minutes ago, you said things become clear in encounter, right? Things become clear in encounter. And this seems to harken back to what I was trying to get at earlier, which was, even if we think we see that someone else is in a state of spiritual illusion or spiritual lying, and the way that Maximus characterizes it, many of us are struggling in the state much of the time, right? How do we approach them? I think we approach them by taking them kind of as they are, not doubting, not unless it becomes glaring. But if truth is discerned in relationship, and if the encounter is central, and you have said before, this is the earlier thought, you have said before that Christ is unique or just wondrous in how he responds every time to a person. And you said that he responds either by blessing or by healing, the spirit of peace, right? Is our way of knowing through encounter or through relationship, does that include our disposition, a disposition of peace, or us struggling to become Christ-like in that form of encounter? Is that also there? Because I think I hear that there, but I don't want to put words in your mouth if that's not the case. Is that not the assumption, but the undercurrent also there, present in what you were saying?
Well, I know that when I'm not at peace in the presence of another person, I'm in the state of presumption.
Okay.
I'm wanting to make it something. Like I want to make it something.
Yeah.
Wrong
on every step.
Thing.
Yeah, wrong on every step. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when I'm at peace, this doesn't happen very often. I'm not sure I can remember when it happened, but
Come now.
But I mean, my sense is that the eye isn't there, and whatever's going on there, there's a much more nimble attitude towards it. A sense that, oh, something's being worked out here, and I don't need to presume about it. Maybe I can try to midwife it a bit, but it's not me. I'm not giving birth to the baby, but maybe I can help a bit. But it's their terms.
And we don't presume, and in that withdrawal of presumption, we don't try to decide about the spiritual state of the other person.
Yeah,
No.
we can, and you said it earlier too, we can disintegrate or contribute to the disintegration of people by insisting that some way in which they formulated something, or what it is they think they really care about, we can react to that in such a way that it can push them deeper. This is one of the big problems with, siloed conversation. There's a difference between ideology and thinking. It's the difference, I would say, between critical thinking and thinking.
Yeah.
You know,
Critique, which measures.
one looks at the disease and the other looks at the wonder.
And the first measures the disease by its own light.
Yeah.
And the second accepts the light of the wonder. That light that Michael was talking about earlier, Lorraine was talking about earlier. Yeah. Lorraine, you've been mulling. What
You
do
got us
think?
into this, Lorraine.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. But what do you make of it? Get us back out.
Mm.
Give us a leg or two up.
I don't, sorry, I'm still mulling, so I don't have any clear thoughts, but
Oh, pardon me. We didn't mean to push on you.
yeah, no,
Just,
that's okay. I'm just trying to find a summary, and I'm struggling to do that, but yeah, bear with me. Come back to me. How about that?
this is a broad thought, but just back to something that I think each of you brought up earlier in your own way. This idea of seeking, or the idea of purity, not moral purity or pure inventory, something like that, but of simple directedness. It seems to me that it almost has to happen beyond or despite our own, as Maximus says, investigating our own. And this goes back to Lorraine, when you were talking about, you shine a light. How demanding are you on yourself in the moment? Am I lying? Am I not? But that's kind of, as you said, that's not really kind of the, what to do. It's not just, And David, you talking about how the patient, I mean, I really love what you brought out of 93, the patient endurance of the saints. And how it's like terrain. You have to walk the terrain to get to the end point, you can't just float.
And we are sinners. We do not know.
Yeah.
I mean, the best of us doesn't know. The best in us doesn't know.
Yeah. Should it be time? Perhaps it's time.